Hello, my name is Roy Poyan, and I am the Director of Families Impacted by Opioids. I want to thank you for joining us today for Fentanyl and Families in Harm's Way. In today's episode, we're going to take a closer look at substance use disorders as a brain disease. This is a very, very important topic, and it requires us to kind of put on our thinking science hat. And we're going to learn a little bit about the brain without it getting too complicated and without us trying to create neuroscientists out of all the families in America. But we do need to understand how the brain functions and why this is not something that they can just will themselves out of. What exactly is going on in a neurological way that makes this so significant that we would call it a brain disease? Because what happens is it becomes a chronic brain disease, meaning like diabetes and asthma and hypertension being chronic diseases, this would fall into those types of categories as a medical condition. Now with this on board with them, they will experience this chronic disease for the rest of their life. That's why we say in the treatment center, we're not going to fix them. We're just going to help reduce its activity and then allow that understanding of what they can do to become an active part of their life in managing it. So when we look at the brain disease of substance use disorders, one of the critical factors is that we understand three primary parts. In the brain, in the back of the brain, in the middle of the back of the brain, are parts that remember. There is a part that remembers everything that we experience. And then there is another part that asks the brain to recall what it remembers in order that it seek pleasure. And then there is another part of the brain that produces what's known as dopamine. And dopamine is a neuronal firing that takes place for very important reasons. Dopamine is released in order that we identify that drinking is good for us, that going to work is the right thing to do, and that sleep is important. We value sleep. And dopamine kind of fires itself to give us that recognition. It hits the pleasure, we find it to be pleasurable because of the reward system, not the reward system, but the memory system identifying for us that the last time we did this, we were rewarded. So with that in mind, those three characteristics, the source of memory, the source of reward, and the source of dopamine play actively, too actively. The drug makes those three the predominant way that we conduct our thinking when taking drugs. What it's overriding is the frontal cortex, the executive thinking, what they call the prefrontal cortex, and that's up front, and it handles logic and reasoning and judgment. What typically will happen in our thought life is we will use logic, reasoning, and judgment in order to determine how we are going to act. The reward system identifies to those, this is, if you do this, this is the reward you will get. And the memory says, yes, last time we did this, we enjoyed that, and it was good for us. So let's do it again. The problem is, with the drugs, pleasure takes over, and now it seeks to be rewarded with dopamine, and a lot of it. And then we have the memory say, yeah, last time you took that drug, it was just incredible. It was so much more than I could produce for you. Go ahead and insert that artificial substance, and let's go through that again. Now that becomes so dramatically large that it overrides everything. And it's really hard to change that. What you have to first do is you've got to get it out of your system. The problem is you go through withdrawal, and that's not a good memory. So often you hear people say, I take drugs in order to avoid the withdrawal. They're remembering that in their memory. And for that reason, their logic and judgment says, yeah, you better take that drug or you're gonna go through withdrawal. So what happens in a very short period of time is they're trying to maintain their level of drug inside their body in order that they don't go down to the level that would actually cause them to experience withdrawal. They want to always stay above that level. And that's the real reason why they're taking the drug, and they're afraid not to. When they go into detox, that's eliminated. The problem is the brain didn't pick up on the dopamine and it's not releasing it. So now they're neither the overload, the massive overload, and we'll identify how massive in this study, but with that in mind, they aren't producing it themselves to replace what the drug had taken over. So now they're not eating right because they're not reminded to do that, and they're not sleeping well, and they're not sleeping well for a lot of other reasons. It's not just dopamine. So all of these conditions are creating for a very negative experience in detox, extremely negative. It's been described as being almost as though somebody was breaking the bones of your body kind of pain. So with that in mind, we need to understand that this disease has taken on a completely different pathway in our neuronal firing. Now we have literally, and I'm not being facetious here, we have about 1 billion neurons in our brain. So because we rechannel some of them, the brain is very elastic, and it's called plastoelasticity, and it has the ability to change back. That's the great news about the brain. However, in order to get there, you have to remove the stimulant, allow the body to recognize that it needs to take over, and that takes a long period of time. In recovery, there are 3 stages. For the first 2 years, they're extremely vulnerable. It's not until the year 3 that they start to really achieve what would be titled as abstinence, and it's not until year 5 that we can expect any kind of real growth. At year 5, they drop to 15% likelihood of relapse. So that continuance of abstinence and sobriety up to 5 years, it's not an endpoint, but it certainly is a mile marker on the road, and it's a joyous one, because the fact is they're less likely at 5 years abstinence to relapse than they are at 18 months, which is kind of a high probability zone, that 18 to 36 months time period. So with that in mind, the brain is changing back when we go, and we're trying to teach judgment, logic, and reasoning in cognitive behavioral therapy while they're at their IOP or residential. In that treatment, they're trying to help orient the person towards corrective cognitive therapy as well as dialectic therapy, where they create the dialogue in their mind, and then that way they can harden that brain elasticity that I talked about. Do you see that this is about the neurons? Do you see that this is about the reward system, the memory system, and dopamine? And do you see why this isn't a matter of you're just not using good judgment? Of course they're not using good judgment. It's being overridden by this drug. Our understanding of that allows us to be more empathetic, not just compassionate. Our understanding of that gives us a rational way of seeing this person, of seeing their behavior. It is absolutely important that everybody understands what is happening with the brain as it relates to this. Now, in regards to MOUD, or now MOUD, now previously called medical assisted treatment, where we're giving them a drug in their abstinence timeline to reduce the cravings so that they can think logically and they can start to turn around some of those channels that don't belong anymore. The fact is they're not taking the drug, so that helps. But their mind is still raging with cravings for like the first 2 years. So for us to expect that they're not going to relapse is unrealistic. Let's learn more about what you're dealing with, what you will be dealing with, and how you can respond. come on over to the family table. Let's sit down and go through this in a little bit more detail. I think that you'll find, I'm assured that you will find this information to be extremely helpful, and I hope you share it with everyone. Well, thank you for joining us here at the family table. And once again, there's a lot for us to go through. We're going to do more of a clinical dive now, and we'll try and keep it as, we'll try and minimize the complexity of this because it really does get complicated. So just, if you would, allow us the luxury of wandering through your thought process. Did I say your thought process? Because that's what this is about. When we are conducting ourselves in an environment, our mind is set up in a certain way. It's an incredible component. There are around 1 billion neurons, and that's no exaggeration, inside of our brain. And we only use, you've heard this before, a fraction of them. However, the brain is designed in different parts, and we've studied this extensively. We have scans that actually will light up a certain color when a particular part of the brain is activated and being used. So we're able to introduce a stimulus and then see how the brain, in a color-coded way, responds and to its intensity. We can even measure the intensity of a craving by a measurement and what they call a metric. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that information now and give it to you, the family members, so that you can understand, more importantly, what's going on with this person's brain. It'll help you answer the question, why can't they will themselves out of this? And the other outstanding question that needs to be addressed is, so why do we call it a chronic disease? On all of these are worth our taking the time today in the Substance Use Disorders is a Brain Disease episode. So what we're going to do is we're going to sit there and say, let's start at the beginning. We have a brain, and the brain is set up in order that we can survive and function. So the brain tells our body parts what to do. And the way that it does that is it uses neuronal firing. And I'd like you to conceptualize that you've got a big bowl of spaghetti, and you take some scissors and you snip some of these long spaghetti noodles, and where those two are snipped, you put little like receptors to release and then little receptors to catch it. Now that spaghetti noodle, although divided, still is connected. When a neuron is formed, it's formed in an electrical pulse. You kind of think like this big cartoon where the pulse bulges out as it moves through the vein, or in this case, the noodle. And it gets to this portion of the noodle that it's broken. That's called the synapse. And the synapse then, it turns it into from an electronic pulse to a chemical. It floats across, and then it reaches the other side where there's receptor sites, and it attaches to the receptor sites, turns it into an electron, and then continues. Isn't that amazing? I couldn't have thought it up. Somebody much higher and more intelligent than me thought this up. And so the way that this now conducts itself, that conductivity, is interfered when we introduce the drug. So we've got this electronic pulse, comes to the synapse where the noodle is clipped, and then it turns into a chemical, floats across, and can't get into the receptor site to continue as an electronic pulse, which means that function that this pulse was going to go to is void of receiving that command. So now what we're doing is we're sitting there saying, well, what happens then? I mean, what happens to that floating component? Well, it starts to like pollute that area of the synapse. A whole bunch of it keeps coming. So we have a little bit of a mechanism that comes in and gathers it up, kind of cleans it up. And it says, wait a second, this is overload. This is too many. So it goes back to the producing neuron and says, stop, we don't need as much. We just don't need it. We got all this stuff here. We don't need as much. Well, that is where the drug comes in. It actually floats in that space, that synapse, and it starts to occupy the other side, the receptor sites. So what was done naturally as a command is now coming down, turning itself into a chemical from an electronic pulse, and isn't able to produce. It's then told to stop sending that command, okay? That command could have been logic. It could have been reasoning. It could have been judgment, okay? And in which case, when that's gone, they may start to sit there and say, well, let's go for the rudimentary pleasure. And we will just ask the reward system, what did we think last time we took that drug? And the reward system says, we liked it, take it. Do anything you can to get it into our system. And if you do, I'll reward you. So the memory talks to the reward system and says, in pleasure, we want more of this. And it's a good thing. And it's overriding your frontal prefrontal cortex, which is where judgment, logic, and reasoning is sitting. So if I were to turn my head and I would show you a brain, this part runs the executive functioning of, okay, this is how we do things. Inside here, I have a reward system and a memory system that talk to each other. And the reward system says, if memory is correct, I will reward you for that. Memory says, hey, we recorded it the way it happened and we liked it. So yeah, you use judgment and logic whether you want to do it. All my function is to tell you this is what we experienced last time we did this. That's why they say, boy, the first time I got high, I've never had it like that since then, but I've always wanted it. And that's what made me try it a second, third, and fourth, and fifth time. The next thing I knew, I kind of had to have it. Well, what ended up happening was it started to override, and it just went to memory and reward, which was pleasure. Okay, so now all of a sudden, executive, reasoning, and logic are left out of the equation. That's why when we say you should want to get yourself out of this, you're asking them to use a functionality of their brain that is now being overridden. And it's very likely that they're gonna have a lot of hard work in overriding that on purpose. So what then does our mind, our brain tell us? Well, if you were to take a measurement, and if dopamine is, and it is the electronic pulse from the neuron that is sent to get us up in the morning, to remind us that we do like water and water is good for us, to eat, to have sex, to go to work, to do a good job. So dopamine kind of tells us to do that. Number one, if we didn't have it, we wouldn't live, because it tells us all the things that we need to do in order to run our body. But number two, when we're looking at dopamine, we're looking at it in terms of measurements. It's about 50 deciliters for you to get up out of bed. Believe it or not, that's dopamine. It's about 100 when your boss congratulates you at work. You get this feeling of pleasure, and that's dopamine. And then sex has its own level, food and eating and water, social activities, dopamine, dopamine, dopamine. But the fact is, when a drug is introduced, we're not talking 50 to 100. We're talking more like 2,000. That is just such an over exaggeration of dump into that synapse that in the reuptake, it's telling the brain, stop producing dopamine. We don't need it. And the memory system says, that's right, and we kind of liked it. The reward system says, you do it again, I'll give you pleasure. So all of a sudden now, we're like liking this drug because it's so much more than we can produce in terms of pleasure for ourselves than what our brain would normally be able to produce, which would be a normal amount. I mean, it's enormous exaggeration of more. So with that in mind, when we see a trigger and we're in sobriety or we're in abstinence of using, and that trigger hits our memory system, and our memory system says, oh, haven't seen that for a while. Yeah, as I recall, we really like that. Go get it. And the reward system sits there and says, you know what? If you go get that, I'll reward you with pleasure. And you've had a little bit of time in your recovery that now all of a sudden you're logic and you're saying, judgment says no, and reasoning says no, and logic says no. And so no, we've cognitively trained ourselves to identify this as a trigger, and memory says, yes, actually we have. And through cognitive behavioral therapy, which is what they're doing when they're in their recovery treatment centers, we're starting to retrain the brain not to listen to the memory, not to listen to the reward system, and not to seek pleasure, but rather to get the enjoyment in a more natural way of what is our reasoning, logic, and judgment. And so thereby doing a completely, the brain's very elastic, meaning it can bend, turn, and twist, and survive very well. So now all of a sudden we're retraining the exercise. If it was a muscle, we're strengthening the muscle to be able to pick up that barbell. You know, now all of a sudden, because we've been doing this in this cognitive behavioral therapy practice sessions during our meetings, we're actually able to do it more frequently than not. But that's not going to go away. And what we're doing in the study guide is we're identifying the characteristics of that's not going to go away. And it's important for us to know that in our examination of the brain, neuroscientists have statistically proven that that's not going to go away. And that's why the DMS-5 is able to give characteristics of behavior that would suggest that this diagnostic is correct when being assessed, that it is a chronic disease. Well, when we say chronic diseases, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about the fact that it's very similar to diabetes, asthma, CHF, COPD. And for that reason, we're saying that just like these chronic diseases, you may have a relapse. Sure, they have relapses in those chronic diseases. Well, they do in this one too. And although the similarity may not be for the same types of triggers, it is typically something that is kind of more of a breakthrough in the sense we were on this path and things were going well, and a variance happened, a trigger was introduced that maybe at that time we had a weakness, we might not have been sleeping well, we might have severe anxiety based on something that's happening in our lives, we lost a job, and all of a sudden we're more susceptible than we would have been 6 weeks ago when we were in charge of our life and things were going well and we didn't have these other factors that weakened us. This trigger could have hit us then and not done anything. But because it caught us in this moment in time, it actually caused a variance, and now we've relapsed. That's true for eating. It's true for a lot of different ways that we handle the chronicness of a condition. So when we start to say, so what can the family do? Well, actually, the family's in the business of environment. You know, we might say that the family is environmentalist. And with that in mind, we look to our workbook and we start to make suggestions on some really important videos. I think one of them lasts an hour. It's an hour well spent. Trust me on this. You will gain so much from the video that's in here, that's on YouTube, that you will watch. Break out a pad of paper, invite your family to sit down and view those videos related to substance use disorders as a brain disease that are suggested here. Also on our YouTube channel, which is Solution Finder Workbook Videos, it's a YouTube channel that we have 130 videos set up so that you can go into there. If you were to just to play around in that area, you'd learn an awful lot. But there's 3 videos for every one of the 32 episodes for this series of learning. And that way it complements, and some are 15, 10 minutes, some are, you know, like I mentioned, an hour. But they're all of these professional resources that have done incredible work in the area of topics that support areas that you really will benefit from knowing. So do take the time to view the videos, take the time to complete the practical exercises that are in your workbook so that you give yourself the benefit of being able to take what's being introduced in terms of this is a brain disease. This is not a situation. It's not a personality flaw. This is now a brain disease. And they're going to start to build up tolerance, which means they're going to need more of the drug. And we'll talk about that in the stages of relapse and also the fact is that this is a chronic disease and it progresses in stages. Hello, I want to thank you for continuing to view our episode. And we're now going to work into the area of the 3Ds. This is an important characteristic for the family to develop skills in. And we'll start by taking the time to look at an issue and then determine the issues based on the area of determining a solution, developing a decision, and designing a plan of action. By using your Module 3 workbook and going to a specific issue, you'll be able to find that the first step in that 3D skill set is the FTR, the Family Transformational Model. And the Family Transformational Model is a set-up way, each time the same way, that we will take 5 categories to look at in determining a solution. And each category is going to have 3 questions. So let's get started. The first is to define the issue. Naturally, we'll want to know what the issue is. The word issue is really problem, but we're saying the word issue is, the reason we're saying the word issue is it's just a little bit easier to digest, because it's not always a problem. Sometimes it's just something that's happening, and we need to determine a solution to it. The next question is, how does the issue impact the family? We need to know that. We need to know, we have an issue, that's fine. The issues can exist, but if it's impacting the family, in what way is it impacting the family? And then what steps can the family take to prepare and then respond to the issue? That's very important for us to know. The fact is that this issue exists and it's impacting the family. We tend to believe maybe there was something we could have done to kind of get ready for it. And if there was, then we would want to have taken those steps, which is what all these episodes are about. And then who can help assist us and the family in our response? So we want to start to ask ourselves, we know that there's an issue, we know that it's impacting the family, and there are things that we could do to prepare for this, but we're probably going to need a resource, information, another person outside of our family, or maybe one of our family members specifically can use their functionality and contribute. So we want to identify that. And then what should the family expect as their outcome? And kind of a start with the end in mind thought, where we're saying, if we're going to do something, it's going to result in something. So is that result desirable? Is that really what we want? Because if we're going to create a solution, then we want the solution's outcome to be what we expect it would be. So in each of these categories that I just described, 1 through 5, there are 3 questions, and we're going to ask ourselves each of these. Let's go back into the first category, define the issue. Clearly state what happened or what will happen. We want to know very clearly what happened or what's likely to happen. And then write that down. Identify who's involved or who should be involved. And then what would you like to have happen or like to see happen? The third question in every category is going to be used. You'll see how in just a minute. But just remember, the third question in every category, So this question right here, the way you answer it, will be reused. Now the next question is, how is the issue impacting the family? Who in the family exactly is impacted? In what way are they impacted? And then the third question is, what is needed to move forward? And then the third category is, what steps can the family take to prepare and then respond to the issue? The three questions again. What needs to be done? And then prioritize that list. Who needs to be involved? And then what will it look like? The third question, what will it look like when completed? Then the fourth category is, who can help and assist the family in their response? The three questions are, how to search and organize this organization to help you. In other words, it's not enough that you know you're going to go and introduce yourselves to a treatment center in your community. You want to start to determine, how do I look for them and organize my way of seeking help, because it might not just be that group alone. You may also need other services to kind of start to create a who can assist us. And it may be many different types of people. What to ask from them, and then what to expect. Remember the third question, what to expect. And then the fifth category is, what should the family expect as their outcome? Well, that has to do a lot with timing. And if it takes a certain amount of time, let's be realistic of what that is. That has something to do with the expense of the involvement, of getting involved in this issue. And then the third question being, required changes, our changes as family members, for this response to successfully take place. Now, let's state what our solution is. Hey, this is the great news. You've already developed your solution. By answering each of these three questions, the third question in every category, you'll pull forward now into your statement. So your first sentence of your statement is the third answer in the first category. What would you like to have happen or like to see happen? Well, that becomes your first sentence. So what your first sentence for your solution statement is, what we would like to see happen is, and you just pull your answer from there to here. Do the same thing with the second category. How does the issue impact the family? Using the third question's answer, what is needed for the family to move forward? So now your second sentence is, what's needed to move forward is. And now you're accumulating these answers from these categories, the third question, and it's actually becoming your first sentence, your second sentence, your third sentence, your fourth sentence, and your fifth sentence in your solution statement. So your solution statement is going to sound something like, what we would like to see happen is, and what's needed to move forward will be, and then the third question from the third category, what it will look like when completed will be, and then what we expect will be, and then what's required for us to have a successful response is. Now those are your 5 sentences. You've just constructed your solution. And this is how you go back using a model for creating a solution. For any issue in life you have to face, you can use this as a way of approaching it. Now let's go to the other area, which is the second coping skill, making a decision. Let's make a value-based decision. Let's make a decision each time that kind of balances with what we value most. So first we want to determine, what are our values? Well, the best way to do that is to write down on a piece of paper, what types of things do you as an individual value most? And each member of your family can do this in a kind of a group exercise. And then once you've done that, I value love, I value honesty, I value relationships and sharing. These could all be an individual's 1, 2, 3. Then prioritize them. Which of the 1, 2, 3 is most important? Then have each member of the family do the same thing. And then you can sit there and say to the family, what was your number 1? What was your number 2? What was your number 1? What was your number 1? What was your number 1? And then what was your 2? What was your 2? What was your 3? What was your 3?
And where you start to see many people in the family say, well, my number one is relationships, my number two was trust, and my number three was love. Well, then you talk to another person, they say, well, my number one was love, my number two was personal expression or confidentiality, or so they mentioned something different, but they did mention love. And then the third member of the family happens to mention love also. You know now that love is a value of the family. So whatever decisions you make, you want to balance it on the fact of, does this disrupt our values? If it does, at least you know that it does, and to what degree. You're calculating that. But at least also you're including, what do we value most? Let's make sure our decisions don't counter that. And now, in the first step, we're going to identify exactly what's happened. And this is, by the way, in your book, okay? And it is for each of the episodes. Now, identify exactly what's happened, what happened, how did it happen, who did it happen to. Then the second step is analyze the situation, assess the problem, identify the problem, and in what areas did the problem create an impact. You're writing all of these down. The third step of that the third step in the decision-making model is, what is the number of one contributing factor? What is causing this issue to take place? You need to know that before you make a decision. The fourth step is, now that you know the number one factor, you need to go out and find out what information there is about this. Your primary source, you're going to go to the actual person or organization that's involved with this and ask them, what is this issue, and help us to understand it better. The secondary source would be, somebody's telling you this happened, or somebody suggests that you should do something a certain way, and it's coming from somebody else other than the primary source. It could be an article, a clinical paper. These are all secondary sources, and you gather them and you make them part of your primary, secondary information gathering. The third area that you look at is your gut. What does your gut, because that's often where our faith comes in, and other things that are very important when making decisions get included. So trust your gut is what we're saying in the decision-making process. The fifth step in making a good quality decision is where you're taking a criteria and saying, let's take what we're going to make a decision about and let's balance it on the criteria to make sure that we're covering all of our bases. And this will ensure safety of your loved one. Is safety a part of what's being considered? And do we have the resources that are needed to do the decision we're looking at? And then, do we understand the timetable? Is it realistic? And do we understand the negative impacts? Because every decision has a positive and negative. Well, identify what the negative outcomes might be so that you can weight the factor of, is this a good decision? And then, would you do this would you ask others to do this if they were doing it for you? Meaning it was done for you or to you. Is this still a good decision? These are all areas that you want to take a look at. The third coping skill is in the area of the family plan of action. And everybody could say, well, Roy, listen, we're just going to go out and do it. Well, it's going to get done a lot more effectively. I want to warn you that the addiction industry is not organized. And then again, either is the family. So you're taking two disorganized organizations and you're putting them together. So a plan is a very good idea. The other factor is, you're going to more than likely require the assistance of a lot of different groups. And as time goes by, those groups are going to change. And now it's a whole new set of groups that you're dealing with. When you're at the hospital, the ER, that's what that is. Then you move over to detox, that's what that is. Then you move over to therapy and treatment, and that lasts for 16 weeks. That's what that is. Then you're looking at sober living, recovery, maybe incarceration, and then reentry. On all that's involved in that. So there's all sorts of reasons why a plan put on paper based on the decision and the information gathering that you've made, based on the solution that you want to use, are very good ideas. It all comes together with the plan of action. Then you take the plan of action and you go find a professional to help you. Everything that we've done up to now is to position you to a place where you can be properly assisted and directed and supported. This is what's often missing in the families. This is what exhausts the families. This is where the families get into fights internally on. So, for that reason, we're going to apply the 3D coping skills. Determine a solution. We're going to develop a decision, and we're going to design a plan of action. And we're going to do it each time. I hope this is helpful for you. I'm confident it will be.